Hello, and welcome to our PowerPoint module for this week. We're going to be discussing power and politics as they relate to public health. We have a few objectives for this week. So one is to introduce health policy. What do we mean when we say health policy? The second is to consider the role of politics in shaping health-related policy, and we'll distinguish between policy and politics in a moment. And finally, we're going to apply policy and politics to the example of gun policy. This is one example we're going to use, our primary example for the week, but we will also consider other examples for policy and politics. And here are your deliverables for this week. As usual, you have your reading question due Monday by midnight and your PowerPoint module due Tuesday by midnight. And then you also have an assignment due this Friday. That is to complete and submit your paper topic proposal. I have created a link on Inquire for you to submit that. So that is due Friday by midnight. So let's start coverage of our topic for this week with an opening question. Here's your opening question. How would you define health policy? Identify an example of a health policy that affects your daily life. Anything that comes to mind. So at this point, you can pause the PowerPoint module, go to Inquire, and answer that opening question. Before we delve into health policy and examples of health policy, let's go over a few terms that are relevant here. Policy, law, and politics. These are very interrelated, but they do mean different things. So let's start with policy. Policies include laws, regulations, organizational practices, funding priorities. So policy is a pretty broad term, and it includes laws, but it is not exclusively laws. Policies can and often do guide the functioning of institutions and organizations, meaning that they aren't necessarily trying to direct the behavior of individuals, but they are trying to have a set of priorities or practices that an institution as a whole should uphold. For example, tax policy. There are laws attached to tax, right? There are certain taxes that you need to pay, but as a whole, taxes are policies. Tax policy is something broader than just the laws themselves. Laws, on the other hand, are a bit more specific. Here we're talking about certain standards or procedures that must be followed, and usually these are directed at individuals. So how individuals must behave in a society. We have a lot of laws, and these primarily are there to enforce rules. Maybe enforcement of these rules does connect to a broader policy goal, but laws are a bit more specific. There are a lot of laws that shape our lives. Seatbelt laws and laws against littering are the two I have here, but we can think of many more. And then finally, politics. Politics is a pretty loaded term now. It's used in many different ways, but broadly we can think of politics as the process of group decision making. And group decision making within politics or the political process does include politicians, right? Those who are within the political system, but it also includes voters and constituents from outside of politics itself. Lobbyists are also a part of the political process. So lobbyists are groups of people who have a common goal and they want to see that enacted through policy or law. We could think of the NRA, the example that you read about, as a lobbyist or a lobbying group. Now, the important thing we're going to discuss within the realm of politics is the division of power and how political actors have different levels of power, and that influences the political decisions that are made and who benefits from those political decisions. And we certainly see this with the example of gun policy, which is what we're going to focus on in a moment. But before we get into the example of gun policy and connect that to politics, it's important to very briefly go over the US political system. And this is by no means an exhaustive account of how policymaking operates in the US. Rather, this is a very basic overview of one distinguishing feature of the US political structure, and that is federalism. So the US political structure is an example of federalism. This means that there are multiple levels of government that are responsible for different things. We have our centralized federal government, and we have our more localized state governments, and then municipal governments within states. And there are benefits to this system, and it's not unique to the US. However, what we see is that states do tend to have a lot more power and leeway when it comes to political decision making compared to other countries that have a federalist structure. And there are benefits to this system. It allows for regional variation based on need, so regional variation in policymaking, depending on what's needed, depending on cultural values and preferences, and other things that shape regional priorities. And there are benefits to this. It allows for some flexibility. However, there are drawbacks. We've seen this with COVID. If states are left to make a lot of these decisions related to public health, we see uncoordinated public health responses. And we see a lot of variation in policies that relate to public health. Now let's get to our example of gun policy and also how this relates to politics. So the US is known for having relatively lax laws and policies around gun ownership. And we see that federal gun policies, and there are many federal gun policies, these include barring convicted felons from owning a gun, requiring background checks, age restrictions, and so on. These federal policies do provide some national level restrictions on gun ownership. However, these are not especially airtight policies. And so we see that there are a lot of loopholes and there's a lot of room for interpretation. And because of that, we see huge variation in how states handle gun policy, with a lot of gun restrictions in some of like California, for example, New Jersey, for example. These are states that have a number of gun restrictions and gun-related policies compared to a number of southern states that have relatively few policies related to guns. And this huge amount of variation in policy has led to a lot of variation at the state level in gun-related deaths and gun violence. So there definitely is a correlation between the existence of gun policies and the frequency and prevalence of gun violence. All right, so we do see that. We're going to get into the next couple of slides. We're going to talk about how all this connects to politics. Why do we have such lax federal gun laws, and why do we see so much variation across states in the extent of gun policy? And that relates to politics. That relates to who is in power and who is making these decisions. All right, now for your video question. I actually have a clip from last week tonight. So this is John Oliver. It's on Inquire, and it's all about the NRA and gun policy. Watch the clip and then answer the following question. How has the NRA managed to thwart efforts to reduce gun violence in the US? And there are a few examples throughout the video clip, so you can just list those examples. So you can pause here, watch a video, answer the video question, and then return to the module. So beyond thinking about gun policy, which is the primary focus of our module, I also want to give you the opportunity to think about other policy areas that are very much connected to health. When we think about health policy, we might assume that we're talking about healthcare, or we're talking about things like a cigarette tax or a soda tax. And these are health policies. However, this is a very narrow sliver of really all of the policies that impact health. This is really the point of the Health in All Policies initiative. And I did have you peruse that website just to get a little information about what Health in All Policies is. And really this initiative is arguing that we need to consider the implications for health in every policy that exists or could exist. We need to think about how environmental policy is connected to health, economic policy, yes, healthcare, but also neighborhood structures and how policies shape neighborhood structures, law enforcement, education, and this is an incomplete list. So all of these policy areas have implications for health, and you know this, you're in the social determinants of health course. I know that you know this. But I do want you to consider these other areas, maybe in thinking about your course paper. How might policy changes in these areas affect the prevalence of the disease that you're studying? I also want to point out that there is a troubling trend here where we see all of these areas listed on the slide and many others have become more and more politicized. So politics and power structures are playing more of a role in the policymaking process instead of evidence-based. This is troubling, and we will talk about the implications of this in class. Here's your closing question. This is an opportunity for you to connect the topic for this week to your course paper. So I want you to identify a policy or a broader policy area. It doesn't have to be a specific policy or law. I want you to identify a policy that influences the prevalence of the disease or health outcome that you chose for your course paper. And then speculate on changes that could be made within this policy area to improve population health. And I'm not asking you to do any research here. Just really speculate based on what you already know about public health. What kinds of policy changes might improve population health on the outcome that you are studying for your course paper? So you can pause here, answer that question, and come back for the last slide. All right, that concludes the material for the PowerPoint module for this week. As usual, we're going to have our in-class group meet on Wednesday and our Zoom group meet on Friday. And we're going to discuss the connection between policies and population health using several examples. Please do come prepared to discuss. I will see you in class.